The patients began with common symptoms: a fever, labored breathing. Some began presenting muscle spasms and bloated. They were treated according to policy for influenza. The antivirals had no appreciable effect on the patients. Of the 10 patients of record, 3 died at this stage of infection. They were younger than 9 years of age. 4 of the remaining 7 were readmitted within 3 days of release. The remaining 3 were not seen again at the hospital. The 4 patients who were readmitted underwent gastric irrigation. Leaves and stems were retrieved from all 3 of their stomachs. Additionally, we found some small fragments of pink and white flour material. Multiple doses of activated charcoal were administered. The final diagnosis was cardenolide poisoning. They had been eating milkweed. We made a temporary policy to treat those symptoms with activated charcoal. Most of the patients were seen multiple times for cardenolide poisoning. We noted a not insignificant mortality rate with these patients. We thought that it was just a new fad, like the Tide Pod Challenge or the Cinnamon Challenge. With closer review of the small amount of data we had collected showed a much higher rate of younger children being affected. We issued a public warning. Please keep your children away from milkweed. It wasn't a simple case of kids being kids though. Caregivers reported their children thrashing when restrained from a source of milkweed. They scratched, bit, and frothed at the mouth. They absolutely lacked the self-control that they previously had. Mortality rate, relatively speaking, skyrocketed as the cases progressed. One particular case, a 16-year-old basketball player began developing white striations on his skin, separated by webbed black bands. Underneath the skin was pockets of white fluid. We took samples and sent them to our medical lab, and then to an independent lab when our lab came back empty. They were sequestering the cardenolides. We suspected that it was a Pika epidemic, but they only seemed to eat the milkweed, and not other random objects. Then while treating a handful of patients, 2 new cases were rushed in. Twins, Eli and Ella, 16 years of age, presenting white striations, unresponsive with severely swollen abdomens. Both were in the same isolation room. Their conditions were stable. Some of the swelling had went down following their gastric irrigations, but it seemed to be primarily body fat at this point. The twins had been a short time without a visit from the nurse. When the day the nurse came in for their assessment, the room was devoid of the sunshine that should have been beaming through the windows, or even the warm buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights. The nurse tried to turn on the room lights, but not so much as a flicker. The light coming in from the hall showed that Eli was missing from his bed. She pulled the privacy curtain between the 2 beds and Ella was also missing. The shock of losing what amounted to a coma patient slowly washed away as she noticed the shiny green block in the lights in the window. She slowly grabbed her personal cell phone and turned on the flashlight with a shake. 2 large, hard capsules hung from the ceiling. Somehow, they had shorted the lights when attached to the ceiling, and their positioning completely overtook the window. The police were contacted regarding the missing patients. A similar story occurred to a patient across the hall, who was also suffering from cardenolide poisoning. We cut one of the pods open. A body dropped out, mangled and covered in goo. It was Eli. His skin held its discolorations, but was now hard, almost chitinous. He had also lost most of the bone mass of his mandible. The skin had descended into a straw-like structure. When their eyes were opened to check for photopupillary reflex, the entire eyeball was black. The nurses who were supposed to assist me with the examination quit on the spot. Ella was in a similar spot. Both patients exhibited no movement or response to stimuli, and had body temperatures inclined with the ambient room temperatures. And then they started spasming. The assisting physician who managed to make it through the assessment started shrieking. Eli and Ella started to vocalize. It was a throaty clicking, rather than any semblance of a noise an animal would make. The commotion drew the attention of the armed security guard, who equally panicked and ended both Eli and Ella's lives before further conclusions could be made. Their bodies were cremated before we even contacted the families. The board of directors concluded that this was in concurrence with orders from the NIH or the CDC. They claimed it was to prevent an epidemic. A plain white box truck was at the hospital within the hour. They didn't identify themselves. They went straight for Eli and Ella's room. They took the cocoons and scrubbed the room with enough solvents to put the rest of us into respiratory shock. Cell phones were rounded up and scrubbed for any relative data. I was cornered into the room across the hall from Eli and Ella's, the one with the third pod. They cut down the pod and they wheeled it out, covered with black tarps. The head of the board came into the room too. You're being reassigned for the moment, he said casually. You'll receive additional payment for all the trouble. One of the men in suits reassured me. One look told me all I needed to know. This was not an option. I quit, I said flatly, trying to hide my fear under a guise of confidence. They shrugged in unison. You're still coming to work with us, Dr. Druga. Why me? I'm just an observer, I snapped. Ma'am, you have the most hands-on experience so far, he stated matter-of-factly. You're helping us. Who are you, Agent J? I snapped again. All in good time, good doctor. Please come with me, he said, more emphasis on the order than the niceness as he exited the room. My boss shrugged and motioned for me to go with him. They loaded me into an unmarked van. The windows were blacked out. I could feel the van turning, but I couldn't see outside. Hours passed before the door slid open. I had arrived at my new assignment. It was completely unremarkable. A beige strip mall that looked abandoned. Windows tinted, no signs with the cracked parking lot that held more weeds and vehicles. More men with suits ushered me into the building. Everything had to be unlocked with the tap of a keycard. Fluorescent lights illuminated rows of doors paired with large windows. The glass panes sandwiched with steel reinforcements. The man from earlier motioned for me to approach one of the windows. He pointed to the back corner. One of the green pots from the hospital was hanging in there. He grabbed a clipboard from the wall and he leafed through the packet. This one is probably just about ready, he said, directing me to observe. It's been about 12 days since this one entered the chrysalis. The green mass shook. It bulged and cracked. Two black and orange limbs burst through the strange shell. The ends unfurled into hands, grabbing and tearing at the green prison. A second pair grabbed the sides and lifted the striped body out of the chrysalis. What the hell is that? I demanded. That is why you're here, Dr. Druga. I could scarcely tell that it had ever been a human. The legs were seated slightly above the hips. Long, wet wings unfurled into the air. It beat them gently into the air. The mouth was a fully formed proboscis. The eyes were fully compounded. A guard went in and shot it through the center of its head. It still bled. The musculature of a human. I performed the autopsy. I started studying Lepidoptera on the compound. The sequestering, the colorations, the pupation time. It mirrored almost perfectly. Certainly inside of statistical significance. No information was available on the extent of these changes. Were they purely cosmetic? Vivisection was our next step. I mentally prepared myself by making unsubstantiated claims that they were now simply large insects. They didn't respond to normal human stimuli. Their grotesque proboscis slurped simple syrups from brightly colored bowls. I gathered my men, a few battle-hardened orderlies, more jarhead than nurse, but they just needed to restrain patient number 9. He had been out of metamorphosis for a few hours and wouldn't put up much of a fight. My obsidian scalpel cut through the chitinous growth. I used a probe to push away the black muck. Some of patient 9's teeth were still intact, despite his lips being gone. The jaw was no longer functional, even to extreme pulling and pushing. I could only locate it because of the location of the teeth. I sampled the black goo for analysis before moving on to the appendages. The bones were almost completely reabsorbed, though we did find a small amount of red tissue remaining. I cut a sample out of it for analysis as well. I pried one of the compound eyes up. No human eye remained. I cracked and cut the carapace at the oral end of the patient. With some water and suction, I cleared enough of the muck to find the human brain, shriveled and rotting. A single shot rang through the compound. The lab results came back a few days later. We found both Aphriosis electroscira and nuclear polyhedrosis virus. These are 2 somewhat common diseases in monarch butterflies. We sequenced DNA retrieved from both samples. The black muck was mostly disease and monarch genetic material. The red tissue that we found was mostly human, with some virus and protozoan genetic material. However, it had been spliced with monarch DNA. We are attributing this to the MPV virus uptaking monarch DNA before being transferred to the new host, and then some of the material being added to the host DNA. After consideration of the disease vectors, we believe the virus is piggybacking on the protozoan. Please, avoid flowers, which may have the infected spores on them. Other botanicals may be carriers as well. We are unsure of the infection rates. We cannot cure it.